The morning was supposed to be ordinary, just dust, heat, and the slow scrape of tools on stone. But then, a flash of color broke through the earth. The diggers froze. The sun caught the surface, and there, under 1,500 years of silence, words began to appear. Words that would stop archaeologists in their tracks. They weren't random markings. They weren't weathered beyond recognition. They were clear, deliberate, and ancient. And as the dirt fell away, the name came into view: Peter. The team had been working on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, in a patch of land most people pass without a second thought. This place, called El Araj, had been dismissed by many as nothing special. Maybe the remains of an old village, maybe not even that. But beneath the surface was something no one expected: the foundation of a massive church. At first it looked like any other ruin: broken walls, scattered stones, the bones of a building long dead. But the floor was different. Under a thick layer of mud lay a mosaic so bright it looked like it had been placed yesterday. Tiny tiles, blues, reds, golds, set in patterns so perfect they could only have been made by master craftsmen. And right in the center, in flawless Greek, were the words that made every person on site go still: the chief of the apostles, holder of the keys of the heavenly kingdom. The title wasn't vague. It wasn't poetic guesswork. It was the exact language from the Gospels when Jesus tells Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." For the archaeologists, this wasn't just history. It was a direct echo of one of the most famous moments in the Bible, immortalized in stone. If you believe the past still speaks, make sure you're subscribed. There are more discoveries like this unfolding right now, and you won't want to miss the next one. Dating tests confirmed the age: 5th century. That meant this church had been built over 1,500 years ago, during the height of Byzantine rule, when Christian pilgrims traveled across the world to walk where Jesus once walked. And whoever built this place wanted the world to know: here, Peter was honored above all. But the biggest question was, why here? Why would such a grand church, dedicated to Peter, stand in this quiet spot by the lake? That's when old maps and ancient writings began to resurface. The Bible mentions a fishing village called Bethsaida, the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. For centuries, its exact location was a mystery. Some scholars thought they'd found it further inland, but that didn't fit a fishing village at all. El Araj, on the other hand, sat right where the shoreline would have been 2,000 years ago. The evidence started stacking up. Roman coins, fishing weights, and pottery dating to the time of Jesus were pulled from the soil. Every new find pointed to the same truth: this wasn't just a random village. This could be Bethsaida itself. Then came a voice from the past. In the year 725, a Bavarian bishop named Willibald traveled through the Holy Land. He wrote about spending the night in a church in Bethsaida, dedicated to Peter and Andrew. For centuries, most thought it was a legend. But now, here were the ruins of that very church, in the exact location he described, with Peter's name carved right into its floor. The mosaic's message went even further. It included a prayer, asking Peter to intercede for a man named Constantine, servant of Christ, and for his children. This wasn't just decoration. It was personal. It told us that the people who built and prayed here didn't see Peter as a distant figure in a book. They saw him as alive in heaven, listening, with the authority to act. The craftsmanship was just as extraordinary as the words. The pigments in the tiles came from as far away as the Sinai Peninsula, which meant whoever commissioned this spared no expense. This was more than a building. It was a statement carved into the very earth, a statement they wanted future generations to see. By the 6th night, the scope of the place was clear. This was no small chapel. It had a sanctuary, guest quarters for pilgrims, even a baptistery. It was built to welcome the faithful from far away, to let them stand where Peter once stood, and to remind them of the words Jesus spoke to him. And then, the detail that no one could shake. If this really was Bethsaida, then these stones had seen more than the rise of an empire or the passing of pilgrims. They had seen the footsteps of Jesus himself, and for 1,500 years, buried beneath mud and reeds, they had been holding on to a message, waiting for someone to uncover it. But the ground was hiding more than stone. Only meters from the mosaic, the diggers struck a layer of blackened debris, thick, greasy soil, fused with shards of glass and splintered beams. It wasn't the slow rot of time, it was the sudden violence of fire. The edges of the wooden fragments were still jagged, as if torn apart in a single night. Carbon dating told the rest. The destruction came in the mid-7th century, a time when armies swept through this land, leaving entire towns in ashes. The church had been standing for barely a century when it was swallowed by chaos. Yet, even in ruin, its foundation refused to vanish. Over centuries, the Jordan River's floods covered the site in silt, preserving what war could not erase, as if the land itself was guarding the message beneath. And under that charred layer, the soil gave way to something even older. Massive basalt walls, cut with Roman precision, lying directly beneath the Byzantine foundation. These stones predated the mosaic by hundreds of years, their style unmistakable to any archaeologist. They matched the 1st century, the very period when Bethsaida would have been alive with fishermen, merchants, and the sound of the lake's waves breaking against the shore. Inside one of these older rooms, a shallow pit gave up its secret. 2 small bronze fishing hooks, corroded but intact, lying beside a heavy stone net weight. The objects were ordinary, but here, in the place linked to Peter, they felt almost electric, as if the tools of his trade had somehow survived the centuries, buried just meters from where his name was later enshrined in stone. And then something no one expected. In the far corner of the excavation, a tiny broken oil lamp emerged. Its spout was chipped, but the body still bore a crude inscription scratched by hand, a simple cross surrounded by faint Greek letters. This was no mass-produced relic. Someone had held this, carved into it, and lit it, maybe in prayer, maybe in fear. Whatever the reason, it had been left behind in the earliest days of Christian worship here, before churches rose and mosaics shone. The deeper they dug, the more the earth began to speak. The soil wasn't silent anymore. It was whispering of lives, of hands, of footsteps that history had almost erased. Far from the quiet of the dig site, scholars were scrambling through archives, rereading ancient maps and travelers' journals with fresh eyes. Lines of faded ink suddenly carried new weight. One document, copied by a monk in the 12th century, described a place of the fishermen east of Capernaum where stones of the apostles still stood. For centuries the location was unknown, now the language matched El Araj perfectly. Then came a clue, buried not in the earth, but in water. The Sea of Galilee's shoreline has shifted dramatically over the millennia. Geological surveys revealed that during the time of Jesus, the waterline would have lapped right at the base of El Araj. That meant this wasn't just near the lake, it was on the lake. The fishermen of Bethsaida could have pulled their boats ashore within sight of their own doorsteps. And it changed everything. It meant the ruins of the church weren't just commemorating a saint's memory in the abstract. They were planted directly where Peter's feet once sank into wet sand, where he hauled nets heavy with fish, and where he left it all behind to follow a voice that called him away. But the water has a long memory, and it doesn't give up its secrets easily. Just offshore, divers began sweeping the lakebed, searching for evidence of the ancient harbor. Within days they found it. Submerged stone piers, worn smooth by centuries of waves, lined in perfect formation. This wasn't a natural arrangement, it was the work of human hands, the entry point for a fishing fleet that may have served not just Peter, but generations before him. Back on land, the mosaic itself revealed a final surprise. Under intense microscopic analysis, conservators spotted faint traces of gold leaf embedded between some of the tiles. Decoration so fine it would have shimmered in candlelight, an effect only visible to those standing within the glow of the sanctuary. This wasn't just a public monument, it was intimate, designed to move the heart as much as the mind. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a narrow, hidden chamber beneath the sanctuary floor. No formal records mention it. No one knows if it was meant for relics, sacred texts, or something else entirely. The chamber was empty, but its very existence hinted that the builders were guarding something too precious to leave in the open. Above ground, the dig was now drawing global attention. Archaeologists, theologians, skeptics, and believers crowded the site, each aware that every spadeful of dirt could overturn centuries of accepted history. Yet the land still guarded its greatest secret. If this really was Bethsaida, then somewhere nearby, the burial place of Peter's family might still be waiting, and the only way to know was to push the search beyond the ruined walls. The team swept the surrounding fields with ground-penetrating radar, sending pulses deep into the soil. Almost immediately, the sensors returned an anomaly, a rectangular void, too precise to be natural, lying 3 meters below. Excavation began, and soon the first stones emerged in neat, stacked rows. This wasn't a random pile, it was a tomb. The limestone slabs bore faint chisel marks, their edges worn smooth by time. Inside, bone fragments lay in fragile heaps, the remains of several individuals. But one shard stopped the lead archaeologist cold, a sliver of marble painted with traces of crimson pigment, bearing 2 Greek letters, pi and epsilon. They could mean nothing, or they could be the first letters of a name that would electrify the world. Before the tomb could be fully examined, another find pulled attention back to the church. In the rubble near the apse, a heavy bronze hinge lay fused to a charred splinter of cedar. Analysis revealed it once belonged to a chest large enough to store scrolls. Scrolls that were never found. Whatever had been inside was either taken or destroyed. Far away, in the archives of an Armenian monastery in Jerusalem, a scholar chasing the El Araj puzzle stumbled on a forgotten codex. Its brittle pages contained a list of holy sites visited by pilgrims before the Crusades. Among them was a stone house by the water, where the fishermen heard the voice. The description matched the shoreline layout revealed by the divers, and placed the house within walking distance of the very church, now under excavation. Satellite imagery, cross-referenced with ancient topography, revealed another shock. A faint rectangular outline appeared in a nearby orchard, invisible to the naked eye. Measurements matched that of a first-century insula, a type of shared courtyard home common in Galilee. If Peter's family lived here, it wouldn't have been a grand dwelling. It would have been modest, crowded, its walls smelling of fish and smoke, and yet, from such a place, history turned. As excavators marked the orchard site for future digging, the divers returned from the lake with something impossible to ignore. From beneath centuries of silt, they lifted a lead anchor, still intact, its flukes twisted from strain. Carved into the stock was a single, shallow cross. This was no Roman military relic. This was the tool of a fisherman who carried his faith into the waves. Even the lake's depths seemed unwilling to keep its silence. Back on land, the hidden chamber beneath the sanctuary floor was finally mapped in detail. In one corner, a thin residue clung to the stone, a faint, reddish powder. Tests identified it as cinnabar, a mineral once used to decorate the holiest reliquaries. Its presence hinted that something once rested here, perhaps a relic tied not just to Peter, but to the moment Jesus spoke the words preserved in the mosaic above. And then came the voice from the past. Not metaphorical, literal. An audio reel from 1932, buried in a university archive, captured the testimony of an elderly local farmer, recorded in Aramaic. Translated, his words were simple, but haunting. Beneath the stone of the fisherman, the keys still wait. No one in the room could agree if he meant literal keys, or the keys spoken of in Scripture. That single line was enough to bring security to the dig. The site was no longer just an academic curiosity. It was a potential target for treasure hunters, relic seekers, and those who would rather such discoveries stayed hidden. With the orchard marked, the lake mapped, and the tombs sealed for protection, the excavation season drew to a close. But the work did not. Across the world, institutions were quietly opening their archives, hunting for overlooked records tied to Bethsaida. In the Vatican's restricted collections, a researcher found a marginal note in a medieval manuscript, a tiny ink drawing of a church on a shoreline, with the words, "Where the promise was made," scrawled beside it. Meanwhile, in a dusty storeroom in Istanbul, a crate of unclassified artifacts from the late Ottoman era was opened for the first time in over a century. Inside was a basalt basin, worn smooth by countless hands. Along its rim were three names, carved in Greek: Andreas, Ioannis, and Petros. No one could prove where it had been found, but its style matched the stonework of the ruins at El Araj exactly. If the basin had stood in the church's entryway, it would have been the first thing a pilgrim touched. The water within would have been drawn from the same lake Peter once fished, a tangible link across 1,500 years. And yet, for all the physical remains, one question hung heavier than the rest. If the words on the mosaic were truly inspired by Jesus' own voice to Peter, then where had they been recorded before being set in stone? Somewhere there had to be a written source, a fragment, a scroll, a copy, carrying those same lines. In a secure lab, under the glare of microscopes, conservators began a painstaking re-examination of the tiniest debris from the church floor, and there, embedded in centuries-old plaster dust, was a speck of ancient parchment barely the size of a fingernail. The ink was so faint it was almost invisible, but when viewed under infrared light, letters emerged. Greek again, the start of a phrase, not the whole, but enough to make the lead researcher's hands shake, because the letters matched the first words of the sentence carved in the mosaic. If one fragment had survived, the rest might still be waiting, buried in the same soil that had already given up so much, but not everything. That thought hung in the air long after sunset, as work on the fragile scrap continued under the glow of lab lamps. The parchment was placed beneath a multispectral scanner, each wavelength peeling away centuries of grime. As the letters sharpened into focus, the shadow of the next word began to emerge, a word absent from any known biblical manuscript. It was short, almost abrupt, and it carried the weight of a direct address, as if someone had been speaking to Peter himself. No one in the room dared to voice what they suspected it meant. Then, without warning, the scanner revealed traces of another fragment clinging to the reverse side. Not parchment this time, but papyrus. The ink was darker, fresher, preserved by some unknown process. The script was more hurried, less formal, the kind of writing done quickly or under pressure. Experts recognized it instantly. First-century Greek cursive. The fragment was rushed into deeper analysis, but even before the results came back, something shifted at the excavation site. Local workers unearthed a block of basalt half buried under centuries of collapsed masonry. Its surface was smooth, its edges squared, and across it ran a series of parallel grooves, almost like the pattern left by repeated contact with rope. Whoever had used it had done so countless times in the same direction. A small iron ring was still set into one corner, rusted solid. The team realized it wasn't just a block, it was a mooring stone, a place to tie a boat, directly beneath the ruins of a church. If true, then the shoreline in Peter's day would have been right here, at the very threshold where those words had been carved. The papyrus was finally stabilized enough to reveal one more letter and then another. The words formed into a phrase that seemed impossible because it appeared to be written from the perspective of someone recounting an event. Someone who had been standing there when the words were spoken. Before the implications could settle, another anomaly surfaced. Under one of the church's oldest floor layers, a lead container was discovered, sealed tight and deliberately hidden beneath a slab. Its lid bore no inscription, only a faint indentation shaped like a key. The container's weight was far greater than expected for its size. When X-rayed, the shape inside was unmistakable. A rolled scroll. Conservationists worked for days to open it without destroying it. Inside, instead of a single scroll, there were two, one papyrus, one parchment, bound together by a strip of brittle leather. The parchment was badly damaged, but the papyrus was shockingly intact. It contained a list, each line starting with a name. Some were familiar: Peter, Andrew, John. Others were unknown. But the final line read, not a name, but a place. In Greek, the rock by the water. That phrase was echoed later that week in a completely different discovery. In Rome, a researcher combing through medieval correspondence stumbled upon a letter from an 8th century bishop, complaining that pilgrims were bringing home shards of the fisherman's rock as relics. The bishop warned that the supply would not last forever. Back in Galilee, the mooring stone was examined again. Under the rope grooves, a faint carving emerged. 2 crossed keys. The symbol was unmistakable and older than any surviving depiction in Christian art. As word of the find leaked, the dig's remote location became a liability. Surveillance drones were brought in after nightfall to sweep the perimeter. On one recording, barely visible in the infrared, 3 figures were seen moving along the site's edge. They carried no tools, only flashlights, and vanished into the fields before security could intercept them. The lead archaeologists' team pressed on, working into the early hours. In the darkness of the hidden chamber, a final stone was lifted from the far corner, revealing a shallow pit beneath. At the bottom lay a fragment of oil lamp, still blackened at the wick, and next to it a coin minted during the reign of Tiberius, the same emperor ruling when Peter and Jesus first met. That coin was wrapped in linen. When unrolled, the cloth revealed an embroidered pattern, 2 fish and a loaf of bread, in thread dyed crimson. The design was primitive, but the imagery was unmistakable. The next day, the papyrus and parchment from the lead container were re-examined under different lighting. Beneath the main text on the parchment, invisible in natural light, a second layer of faint writing began to surface. It wasn't in Greek this time, but in Aramaic. And when the first line was translated, every person in the room fell silent. It was a direct quote, one that began exactly where the mosaic's inscription began, but ended differently. In the mosaic, the line stopped at a promise. In the parchment, it continued, into something unrecorded in any gospel, any apocrypha, any early church writing. The continuation was short, only a handful of words. But they were unlike anything the team had seen before, personal, urgent, almost whispered. Words meant only for Peter. And if they were real, then the voice that spoke them had carried across 2 millennia, waiting for the moment they would be heard again. The problem was, not everyone wanted them heard. 2 days later, the excavation was abruptly halted by order of the Regional Antiquities Authority. No reason was given. The site was locked, the artifacts placed in secure storage, and all further research suspended pending review. But late that night, one of the younger team members slipped away with a copy of the multispectral scans. He claimed he wasn't stealing them, only safeguarding them, because he feared that once the review was over, the world might never see them again. Weeks later, in an anonymous message sent to a scholar abroad, a single image appeared. It was grainy, low resolution, but the words were clear enough. The continuation line from the parchment had been translated into English in the margin. And as the scholar read them, he understood why the find had been buried under silence, and why, if revealed, those few extra words might change not just history, but the faith of millions. The message ended there. No scan of the original. No location. Just the words. If what we've uncovered here is true, it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about history and the future. This isn't the end of the story, it's just the first page. So if you want to be here when the next discovery breaks, stay with us. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. And join the search for the truth that's been hidden for thousands of years.